Here's the thing, guys. I know last week I said we were going to get into chapter 2. We didn't finish chapter 1. Yeah, I said chapter 4, but I meant realistically chapter 2 is what I was thinking. No amount of positive thinking was going to make that happen. So here's the thing. I think that we'll pick up in the rest of chapter 1, and then we'll get chapter 2 and chapter 3. Now, before you start laughing out loud, I'm pretty sure it's doable. So I set my timer, and it's got a couple little checks, so it's going to start blinking where I have to be at my chapter point. So we might just be like, hey, read the rest of it by yourself. No, we're going to get to it, though. So if you want to open up to the book of Job, again, chapter 1, again. Last week we started this, and again, truthfully, we kind of only came as far as verse 13, but it did sort of set the stage for some things, and we're going to continue on with setting the stage this evening. But, you know, seeing really is, again, what our approach is when it comes to suffering or difficulties, because the issue that we looked at last week and we'll look at again and for a few weeks at least, and we go through this, is the question of why is never answered in Job. And that's usually the one thing people want to know when they go through the book is why. Like, why? Why does this? Why is that? But it's never answered, and the reality is that's really not the issue. There's never like an explanation at all, but it ends up in revelation. So there's never an explanation that God gives to why, but there's a revelation of who he is, and that really then is the explanation of the why. Everybody with me? Like, I know some of this is like if train A is traveling 59 miles an hour, but if you follow with me again, so the explanation of why, it's the who. He's going to encounter God in his glory, and then everything is going to be put back in place perspective-wise. So to recap, last week, in 2 minutes, what took us almost an hour last week, God is on his throne, right? The angels come around. Satan ends up there. The Lord says, hey, where have you been? It's not that the Lord doesn't know where he's been. He's like, hey, I've been looking for you. Where have you been? But what have you been up to? He's trying to encourage some conversation with Satan. He says, I've been going to and fro all over the earth. He says, hey, Satan, have you considered my servant Job? You know, have you scoped him out? And we know he has, because he starts his discourse with the Lord and he says, yes, I have. You know, he says, well, hey, he's upright. You know, he fears me. He shuns all evil. And Satan says, of course he does, because you give him everything he wants. Of course he's going to be kind to you. Of course he's going to give you glory, because he's like a poster child for the perfect. He gets everything that he wants. And then remember what he's going to repeat here, which we're going to see a couple times here in the chapters as we get through this. He's going to say, if you took it all away, though, if you took all of that away, he'd curse you. And not just curse you, but what, church? He'd curse you straight to your face, right? And just, you have to imagine that picture, Satan there. And I'm sure the angels are like, oh, this is getting tense. So God has this discourse. He says, okay, so the issue, what you're saying is that Job is only worshiping or wanting to be involved in my life, only cares about me because of the stuff that I give him. And Satan says, absolutely. You take that stuff away, he's got nothing, and he's going to curse you, absolutely. So God gives him this permission. He says, okay, you can test him, but don't touch him. And we see that, you know, you can put your hand upon him, and Satan goes straight for the throat, right? When we saw some of that, you know, when the enemy gets licensed, he takes every single bit that he can. But verse 13 then brings us back to earth. So we've been at earth from 1 through 5, 6 through 12, we're up in heaven. And now from 13 to the end of the chapter, again, we're back on earth. So it says, now there was a day when his sons and daughters, speaking of Job, were eating and drinking wine with their oldest brother's house. And the messengers came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them. And the Sabeans raided them and took them away. Indeed, they have killed the servants on the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So all throughout this, we're going to hear about the Sabeans and the Chaldeans. They're the Edomites and the Chaldeans. Later, they'd become the Babylonians. But Satan gets permission, and it doesn't like start like an easy, soft opening, right? He goes straight for it. And that's always how it is. You know, goes and he wipes out his livestock. Verse 16, while he was still speaking, another also came and said, fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you. So before, and it's written this way, before the other guy is done saying, I alone have been able, another guy runs and he's like, fire from heaven came and consumed everything else, Job, that you have. And it's interesting, he calls it fire from God because Satan is sort of placing that idea in Job's mind, and we're going to see some of that as he has his little pity party here, which we'll walk through a little bit, on why he's doing that or what he's saying or really not saying. But, did this fire truly come from God, or is it something, he's having to wrestle through those ideas, just like you and I do when something happens to us. Is this something that God has allowed to happen? Is this something that God is doing to me? What have I done? All those questions begin to come up. Verse 17, while he was still speaking, another also came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands, raided the camels and took them away, yes, and killed the servants by the edge of the sword. I alone also have escaped to tell you. So while the second guy has interrupted the first guy, now the third guy is coming. He's like, oh, I know you got some bad news, but stuff is even worse. Now we're going to have the greatest strike here in verse 18. And while he was still speaking, yet another came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And suddenly a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house. And it fell on the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So remember, Job has 10 kids, right? And they're all together in their oldest brother's house for a big potluck. And so get the picture. Satan gets the opportunity that God says, you can test him, just don't touch Job. Okay, I'm going to take all his livestock. I'm going to take all his prestige. I'm going to take all his workers. And then he goes for the hardest one. He takes all of his kids. And this is sort of the breaking point for Job, because remember here, Satan has this opportunity to take out, the only person he's going to leave in Job's life is his wife. And I know I said that last week, and I don't mean that as like a joke or to be, to give some other point of this, but here's the thing. Her heart is broken, right? She's just lost 10 kids. And she's going to start saying certain things to Job that Satan is going to start whispering to her that are going to be this same sort of call to blaspheme God. It says, then Job arose, tore his robe, and shaved his head, and he fell on the ground and worshiped. So, again, I think about what he didn't do. He didn't raise his hand, at the sky, or why God? Like he kind of goes back. He doesn't, tap out. He doesn't get high. He doesn't get drunk. I mean, doesn't do all the stuff that sometimes we find, ourselves falling into. And this is an unimaginable situation. He tears his clothes as a sign of mourning, shaves his head as a sign of dignity, because, the bigger the beard, the bigger the hair, a sign of dignity. He falls down and he worships. And remember, we know, verse 6 through 12, he has no idea what's going on behind the scenes, right? He has no idea who's pulling the levers or exactly what's going on. Satan had gone before the Lord. He said, hey, he's going to curse you. He doesn't. It says, and he said, naked, verse 21, I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. And the Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So again, a remarkable guy. I mean, just remarkable it's one thing to have all the stuff, right, and all the prestige, but when you think about, I have 4 kids, and I can't imagine if, I got the call and said, your house caved in, all 4 of your kids are dead. That's devastating to me to think about. And in verse 22, and all this, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong. So there's a certain amount of maturity that he has, as he's in these situations. He's turning eyes to God. He doesn't look back. He doesn't curse God. Now remember, Job doesn't know chapter 1. He doesn't know what you and I know. So you have to put yourself in the place of Job, because as we get into chapter 2 and chapter 3 here, we don't know the length of time between chapter 1 and chapter 2. Is it weeks? Is it months? It's probably not years. But is it days, weeks, months? But he's got a broken heart. He's mourning. And it says, again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them, to present himself before the Lord. So remember chapter 1, Satan comes there and God questions him. Chapter 2 now, Satan comes specifically for this reason, to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" And it's kind of the same story. And Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro to the earth and from walking back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on earth, and blameless?" Remember, that doesn't mean he's sinless. It just means that he's mature. "An upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil, and he still holds fast to his integrity, although you incite me against him to destroy him without cause." This is sort of like the proud dad moment, right? This is where he's like, "Hey, have you considered Job? Remember the guy that you said if I took stuff away from him, he would curse me? And yet now he doesn't curse me at all." And all of heaven is listening, right? All heaven is listening to this. He says, "Hey, Satan, your plan didn't work. He's still my kid. He's still listening. You wanted me to destroy him without cause." And here's the thing. When it comes to Satan, it's still the same thing. He still wants to destroy you and I without cause. Revelation chapter 12 tells us, that he accuses the brethren both day and night, but they overcame by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. They love not their own lives unto death. Our overcoming is in that, the overcoming by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. Now we sort of enter into stage 2, right? The second sort of scene in verse 4. Hold up, I have pad thai in my throat, sorry. You don't want to see that a second time. He says, "So Satan answered," verse 4, "and the Lord answered the Lord and said, skin for skin, yes, all that a man has will give for his life." So skin for skin, the idea is you really haven't touched him, God. Like, you've really not taken anything from him. You've taken stuff, but he's selfish, right? He's okay with stuff being taken away. "But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will surely curse you to your face." And again, that's what Satan wants this whole time. He wants Job, he wants you and I to curse God to his face. "And the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life." Now, that's not good, because chapter 1, he said, "Hey, you can test him, just don't touch him," and he takes everything away from him. And now he says, "Okay, you can touch him, but you can't take his life." And he's going to take it to the absolute limits here. It says, "So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with painful boils from the sole of his feet to the crown of his head." These are not just boils, which again, we don't know. The word boils is just kind of like a random term, and does everybody know what a boil is? I was going to bring a picture, but I figured you didn't need to see it. But then it's not just a boil, the fact that it's a painful boil, and it's from the sole of his feet to the top of his head. And if you can imagine again what that's like. I want to read you a couple sections, because as we go through Job is going to make some descriptive areas where he talks about what it was like for him to have these boils. So, the next verse, we're going to find him scraping himself with broken pottery. Chapter 3, verse 24 says, "My sighing comes before I eat, and my roaring are poured out like waters. I can hardly eat," he says, "because I'm in so much pain. I can hardly swallow." Right? So these boils that he has are not just whatever they are not just on the outside, but it's something inward. My sister, I remember when we got chicken pox as kids, my sister got them in her throat. And she couldn't swallow and couldn't eat, and it was horrendous to be around. And he says, I can't even swallow. Chapter 7, he says, "My flesh is clothed with worms and clods of dust. My skin is broken." We'd say it's cracked, and it's become loathsome. Right? It's something that I despise. Chapter 9, he'll say that he will not suffer me to take away my breath. So here's what Job says. He says, "I can't even breathe." So again, what kind of stuff is he going through that these boils aren't allowing him to breathe? He says, "It fills me with bitterness." Chapter 19, he says, sorry, this is funny. "My breath is strange to my wife." You get the idea, right? He's like, man, even my wife knows something is not right here. My bone cleaves to my skin and flesh, and I have escaped by the skin of my teeth. Chapter 30, my bones have pierced me in the night. So, he's lost so much weight, he says, like I'm skin and bones and I can't even sleep. My gnawing pains, King James puts it a little bit different. It says, my bowels have boiled over and they have no rest. Right? So everything within him is hurting. He says, my skin grows black and falls off me, and my bones burn with the fever or heat. So get what Job says. I can't eat. I can't sleep. I can't breathe. My skin feels like it's on fire. I have a high fever. I'm skin and bones. There's infection everywhere, and they're filled with worms. So this is not, my skin is black. This is not just like a big zit, okay? This is something that you and I can't imagine. Chapter 7, verse 3, he'll say, so I have allotted months of futility and weariness of nights they have appointed to me. So he says, this has gone on for months. It's not just a one-day sort of thing. Chapter 29, verse 2, he says, oh, that there were months past when the days when God watched over me. So, this has gone on for months and months. And he's so afflicted, again, from the top of his head, right, the crown of his head to the bottom of his feet. And we have to remember, again, as we go through some of this, the disclaimer, not all illness is from Satan, right? Not every cold is from Satan or hurt finger or whatever. It's foolish to blame all illness on Satan. It can happen, but it is not the rule, right? Sickness comes from the fall of man. That's our fault. And I know you guys know this. It's for the tape for the other people, right? Because I know that sometimes you can feel condemned, and I've been in those situations where somebody is sick and hurting, and somebody says, "Man, if you just believed enough." Right? And here's a person that's broken. They love God. They want to be healed. And they're like, "Man, if you just believed enough," or maybe you have some hidden sin, as if everything is from Satan, instead of the fact that it is just sometimes. God says the rain falls on the just and the unjust. Right? Sickness falls on the godly and the ungodly. So it is the exception. It's not always the rule. And it does go the other way too. You read the book of Revelation. The Antichrist heals or has some aspect of healing. So it can go the other way. Verse 8, he says, he took for himself a potsherd with which to scrape himself while he sat in the midst of ashes. So he's, again, imagine this, he's ostracized here. He told us in chapter 1, we looked at, as we were looking at the very end, that he was one of the greatest men in the East, and now he's reduced to nothing. He has no livelihood, no integrity, no dignity. He feels terrible. He's reduced to nothing. The poorest of people in this time period would sit outside the city in the ashes. Now, we think of the ashes as if it's just this big burn pile. It was where you sent all the garbage and all the dung to be disposed of. And that's where Job is right now. So he was one of the highest men there. It's where dogs and beggars, and don't think of your poodle. These are scavenger dogs, right? These are the same dogs that when Jezebel falls out the windows, consume her, right? And they're like, who let the dogs out? I'm just kidding. To make sure you're alive. So he's sick. They would rub ashes in it to kind of numb the feeling, numb air from touching it. But he's sick. All the people that had leprosy are out here. The sick, the beggars, the scavengers are all out in this dunghill and this garbage pit. And it says, then his wife said to him, as if things cannot get worse, right? This is the thanks, honey moment. Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. Now, some people have tried to translate, because in Hebrew, the word curse and blessing are the same word. It's a positional word. So depending on where you are, it could be a cursing or a blessing. And that is true. But either way, it's still sarcastic, is what she's doing, right? There's still something to it. She's saying, get over this already. And truthfully, we could point a finger at her, but you really can't blame her, right? Of all the other stuff she's lost, she's also lost what? 10 of her kids. And that is hard. If you've ever been struggling through something that just seems so outside of your understanding of who God is and what God would allow and what God would do, there does come that sort of point where it just becomes very real. And the rest of chapter 2 and into chapter 3, is very real. Now, just because it's real doesn't mean it's biblical. And what I mean by this is an account, right? So we can't just take like, hey, I'm just acting like Job's wife here. I mean, okay, that's really not what we're doing, okay? So she says, hey, the only person that's left, do you still hold fast to your integrity? You know, the things that God has said. Again, that word there's integer, right? One. All right, there's no mask, there's no duplicity, there's no hypocrisy. Curse God and die. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now again, he has no idea of the context that's going on behind the scenes. But his wife says, curse God and die. Sounds familiar, right? That's what Satan had said to God, man, if you take this stuff away, he'd curse you to your face. And now he begins to whisper to his wife here. It's in a hard place here. Job is in a super hard place. But he says, when he says, guys, I don't suggest this, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Job knew where that was coming from. I always think of it kind of like with Peter. When Peter's there, with Jesus, and he begins to speak, and Jesus says, hey, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to go to the cross. I'm going to be resurrected. And Peter, he's been on a roll, right? I mean, he's been answering some good questions lately. And he feels like, I'm just going to give a shoe in here. And he says, Lord, may never be. And what does Jesus say to him? Remember? Get behind me, Satan. Now, he's not calling Peter Satan. And I don't think Peter was possessed at that point. But Jesus recognized that voice, right? And it struck a chord with him. And he said, no. I recognize that. Again, I don't think it was Peter's heart. But the enemy was using him. Jesus recognized that voice behind it. I don't think this is her heart to hurt her husband. I think she's just overwhelmed and she's hurt and she's being real. It says, now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this adversity had come upon him, each one came from his own place. So we're going to find these guys. Eliphaz, the Temanite. So the Temanites were Edomites. The Edomites were known for being the wisest of the group. He seems to be the oldest. He's kind of the primary speaker throughout this narrative. Bildad, the Shuhite. So he's a tiny little guy. Come on, guys. That was funny. Thank you, Travis. Zophar, the Naamite. They might have an appointment together to come and mourn with him and comfort him. So again, they're coming, their desire is to mourn and to comfort him. It says, when they raised their eyes from afar, they did not recognize him. Remember, he's shaved, he's sitting in the dung pit with the ashes, he's got boils everywhere, he's scraping his skin. He's skin and bones, he's not slept, he's not being able to eat, he's fighting with his wife. I mean, everything is wrong. They did not recognize him. They lifted up their voices and wept, and each one tore his robe and sprinkled dust on his head toward heaven. So they sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw his grief was very great. Now, what was that like, right? So they've heard from somewhere. These guys are all from different areas. They heard from somewhere, man, something's gone on with Job. Not only has he lost his livelihood, he's lost his house, all of his kids are dead. They realize that he's broken, and they come and they see him, and then they become broken for that. And they begin to mourn. And if you've ever witnessed that or experienced that with somebody, I remember probably 15 or 16 years ago seeing a friend from high school, an old drug buddy of mine, and seeing him and seeing the effects of, like, he switched from one set of drugs to a harder set to a harder set, and we're in our 20s now, and he's addicted to crack and heroin, and you look at him and it's unrecognizable, and it breaks your heart. If it doesn't break your heart, you have no heart, right? And that's what these guys see. Now, it didn't say they didn't know what to say. And here's the thing, they sat with him. I think far too often we really want to know what to say instead of just sitting with people. There are lots of times, and I'll tell you from just even a pastor's point of view, I have no idea what to say. Sometimes the best thing to say is just to cry with somebody and sit with them. And they start off really well, and if they had stayed there, if we didn't get to chapter 4, chapter 5, and chapter 6, because we're going to find Satan is going to start to speak through them. But they sit there with him for 7 days in the dump with ashes on themselves, ripped clothes, and everybody is silent. Nobody's saying a word. So it starts off as a good start, them not speaking anything, and you can tell how much they love him. Right? They're just brokenhearted for him that they don't know what to say. It says, after this, Job opened up his mouth. This is after 7 days and 7 nights, nobody speaking in the garbage heap, and cursed the day of his birth. Now, they've not said anything again for 7 days. And from verses 1 all the way to verse 10, he's going to say, man, I wish I had never been born. Again, he's not saying I'm going to kill myself. And some people have taken these contexts, like where Paul will say, we wish that we had been dead. He's not saying we're suicidal. But he says, I don't even know what the point of being born is. He's in a hard place and he's pushed to a certain point. And it says, and Job spoke and said, may the day perish on which I was born, and the night in which it was said. Now imagine, it's quiet. Nobody knows what to say. And Job finally clears his throat and says, I wish I was never born. Now, what are you going to say to that when your friend is hurt and they're like, man, I wish I'd never been born at all? He said, a male child is conceived. May that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor the light shine upon it. May darkness and the shadow of death claim it. May a cloud settle on it. May the blackness of the day terrify it. As for that night, may darkness seize it. May it not rejoice among the days of the year. So even he's saying, like, I never want to hear another happy birthday in my life. May it not come into the number of months. I don't want to celebrate another birthday period. Oh, may that night be barren or empty. May no joyful shout come into it. Again, no birthday songs or celebrations. Now he's going to speak of the sorcerers of that day. Verse 8 begins a little bit of a different section. He says, may those curse it who curse the day, those who are ready to arouse Leviathan. So speaking of the sorcerers of the day that said that they had power, some translations might say dragons or spirits. It really is Leviathan there, but the idea is this dragon, to be able to conjure up these dragons or these demonic spirits. So may those who curse the day be those who are ready to arouse Leviathan. Like if there's any option for this, for my day of birth to never happen. May the stars of its morning be dark, and may it look for light, but have none, and not see the dawning of the day. So he says, I just want to stay home and be dark. I want to be in the dark. You ever been there before? I just want to stay home. I don't want to talk to anybody. Close all the blinds. I just want darkness all around. Because it did not shut up the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide sorrow from my eyes. I want nothing from the day that I was born, is what he ends up saying. Now, from 11 to 19, he changes gears just a little bit because he says, I wish that after I was born, that I would have just died. So if I can't die before I'm born, then I wish I would have died number of days after. And again, there's a number of whys in here, and he's just being very honest. Why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish when I came from the womb? We would probably say even better, like what's the purpose? Like what's the purpose in life? And that really is like in the midst of you're going through a trial or a tragedy or a difficulty. We're like, why was I born in order to go through this sort of thing? What is the purpose of me being here right now? Verse 12, he says, why did the knees receive me, or why the breast that I should nurse? He says, why was I kept alive? What is the point of this? And again, he's being very real. And you can almost hear Satan starting to whisper to him. And if you've ever been at that point, I mean, that stinks. Or you've witnessed somebody around that point where it's like they're just being very honest. You're like, hey, how are you feeling? And life just stinks right now. Oh, okay. And then they start opening up, and you're sitting there and you don't know what to say. That's what's going on here with Job. Now, Job's friends, unfortunately, are going to try to figure out what's going on, which is not good advice, okay? Well, maybe better just keep your mouth shut and pray for somebody and weep with them. But again, he says, man, I wish that there was death. He's going to say here later on, he's going to say that I wish there was a reprieve in death. But here's the thing that Job is not fully understanding, that sometimes we don't understand, that Satan does understand, is pain is not attached to just the physical, right? So I'll give you a clear instance of this. I've never really slept well, and the older I get, the less well, I don't know if that makes sense, the less gooderish that I sleep. And a lot of them are just nightmares. But here's the thing. I can be in bed with my wife in the safety of our home. And you know when you have those dreams, like where you can only run this fast? You know what I'm talking about? You try to scream and nothing comes out. Am I the only one that has those ones? Right? I had a dream last night that I was in prison. I got put in prison for something. And Laura came to visit me, and she's like, I'll see you in 3 years. Then I don't know what else to say. And I was like, you're not going to come visit me? And she's like, I don't really want to come here. So, and I woke up and I was like, you would come visit me in prison? She's like, what are you talking about? Of course I wouldn't. No, yeah, she didn't say that. But you have that. I can wake up from that dream in a sweat with my heart pounding, and my physical body has still been there. But I can be in misery and torture. And some of the lie that Satan wants to give to us, and especially if you've ever been at that point or you ever encounter somebody that at that point, is that, man, if you take your life, or that, like, the pain is just associated to this. Because there's more to the physical frame there. Job is going to say some stuff. Again, this is dialogue. This is not truth, okay? I want to be very clear. This is dialogue. This is not truth. God is going to open up his perspective here. He's going to say, man, I wish I was at rest, that my life would just be taken away from me. Well, that's not the rest that he's looking for. Is not going to deal with the issue. And God will say, to him later, who is it that darkens the counsel by word without knowledge? And he's speaking to Job. He's like, Job, why are you counseling yourself with this dark stuff? This is not going to solve the problem. You think thinking about death is going to make it better? It's not going to make it better. For now, I would have lain still and been quiet, and I would have been asleep. Then I would have been at rest with kings and counselors of the earth who built ruins for themselves, or the princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Or why was I not hidden like a stillborn child, like infants who never saw the light? There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners rest together. They did not hear the voice of the oppressor. The small and the great are there. The servant is free from his master. Again, that's his perspective. It's wrong, but it's real. Right? I mean, this is real stuff. This could be written today. Now, from verse 20 all the way to 26, he started with, I wish I was never born. Then he goes to, I wish that my life would have been taken when I was young. And now he's going to go to, I wish I could just die now. So he's progressing a little bit, I guess. He says, why is light given to him who is in misery, and a life to the bitter of soul? So again, what's the point? If I'm just going to live in misery, what's the point of living? And you can almost hear Satan kind of saying, hey, Job, what's the point? You don't want to live all day like this, every day of your life. Who long for death, but it does not come, and search it more than hidden treasures. So, why should life come to somebody who seeks death just like somebody that would seek treasure? Now, he's questioning God, but he's not cursing God. And there's a huge difference there, right? When you question certain things, he's He is cursing the day that he was born, he's cursing the fact that he's able to live, that he's allowed to live, but he's not cursing God. He's being very real. He says, who rejoice exceedingly, verse 22, and are glad when they find the grave. Why the light given to man whose way is hidden and whom God has hedged? And so what's the point of living like this is what he says. If everything is like this, what's the point? If everything of my life has come to this point that's been stripped away. And that's even harder, right? I mean, if you've ever had a lot and then have it stripped away, it's harder than when you've had nothing and it's stripped away, because then you're kind of used to it, right? I mean, that's why, like, you go to a third world country, I mean, they have such a better understanding of sharing and giving than we do. Because like, we'll give you of excess if we're okay with it, but it's harder for us in our society sometimes to give out of need. And remember, he's got 3 friends there. Their eyes are probably filled with tears, because, I mean, what do you say to somebody? I mean, if they say, come on, Job, snap out of it, he's not going to want to hear that. I mean, he's overwhelmed. He's got sores everywhere. His skin is black. He's skin and bones. He's not sleeping. It says, for my sighing comes before I eat, and my groaning poured out like water. For the thing I greatly feared has come upon me, and what I dreaded has happened to me. And I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, for trouble comes. It's interesting, before Eliphaz speaks, which we'll look at next week, he says that the thing that I greatly feared came upon me. And I thought about this for a while, because, in chapter 1, we read that Job said, what he's saying here is, I had a gut feeling some of this was going to happen. Have you ever had that happen? You're like, things are just too good. Like, what's going to happen? It's like, I remember one time we were at Costco. Smoothies, they had corn on the cob, steak, and burgers, and pot stickers. I was like, these are the samples that they're giving out today? It's like, it was seriously like one of the best days of my life. I know that's sad, but it was. And I remember I was going through, and I'd gone to the steak guy a couple times, and he's like, oh, you're back again. I was like, yeah, I don't know what you want me to say, dude. I'm back again, okay? I was like, honestly, I would come back and hit each one of these things 3 or 4 times. And he goes, nobody's stopping you. Like, they're free samples. You can come here as many times as you want. I was like, oh, really? Is that what? So I'm just, man, I went through. Now, here's the thing. By round number 5, okay, around number 5, I started thinking, this is too good to be true. I'm probably going to get sick. Right? You start thinking like this, something's going to go on. There's too good, or security's going to come, and they're like, there he is. There's the guy taking all the samples. Job sort of says, hey, I had this feeling in my gut something was going to happen. I remember chapter 1, he says that they'd have a great time together. They'd be feasting with their family. And then afterwards, what would he do? He would go and he'd make a sacrifice for all of his kids. Right? If they had ever done something, and it seems to be that there was an inkling of that. Like, my kids are so special to me. I love them so much. Like, he goes and he has this sort of inkling out of this wrong perspective. It is a wrong perspective of God. Right? God gets bored and he's just like, let's mess some things up. But now he sits in a place where he wants to die. He's worn out. He's broken. He's in pain. He doesn't want to go on at all. And we could think, wow, Job is so weak. Here's the thing. You remember Moses, right? Guy came down from the mountain, Moglo. Remember this guy, parted the Red Sea? Do you remember what he said to the Lord? Lord, kill me. If you're going to wipe out all the people of Israel, and you're going to take my life's work and everything that I've done, to just kill me with them. It sounds kind of familiar, right? I can't take this anymore. Elijah, this is the one that blows my mind. Elijah's there, Mount Carmel. I mean, the prophets of Baal are there. Fire comes down, consumes everything. He says, hey, you guys should be for the Lord. You should wipe out. They come back to the Lord. Not only that, they wipe out all the priests of Baal. Things are going really well, and then all of a sudden, Elijah finds out what? Jezebel's after you. And he runs for the hills, and he's in the caves, and he's whining and complaining. It says he falls down under a juniper tree, and he says, Lord, just let me die now. This lady is crazy. She's going to be out to get me. I can't take this anymore. Jonah, right? God saves Nineveh. It goes up. He's there. A gourd begins to give him some shade. It dies, and he has a temper tantrum. And he's like, God, just let me die. It's too hot out here. And not only that, but God, let me die because I knew you're so gracious you were going to save these people. And I can't stand to see people I don't want to be saved. Right? It's not the person you send to witness it all, but Paul, which is one of the ones that blows my mind, Paul in 2 Corinthians, in the first chapter, he says that we despaired of life itself. We are pressed beyond measure. And listen, again, in these circumstances, this is what he's not saying, I'm going to kill myself, but he is saying, man, life would be easier to die. He's not taking that away, but he's finally going to say this. He says, I find, though, my hour of man is perishing, my inward man is renewed day by day. While we look not at the things that are seen, but we look at the things which are unseen, because the things which are seen are temporal, and the things that are unseen are eternal. Here's what Paul says, which is the revelation that Moses got, the revelation that Jonah got, the revelation that Elijah got, right? The revelation that we're going to see Job get here, but the revelation that Paul got during that time is, he says, yes, the outside is always going to be dying, right? Regardless if you're diseased or not, this is dying. This tent is dying every single day. You're like, man, I'm so glad I came today. So excited. But he says this, I don't get my batteries charged month by month or week by week. He says, it happens day by day. That's how he ends that section. That's how he's able to focus on not the temporal, but the eternal. It's not the, months at a time that I'm charged, or I get a week's worth of Jesus and that takes me on. He says, no, this is day by day. It's interesting. He says, while we look to these things, the word is scopio, microscope, telescope. The idea of what Paul says, what Job is going to see in this revelation is, man, when I bring everything into focus and everything into view from God's perspective, that's what keeps me going on. Right? Asaph, Psalm 73. I know I've said that a million times now in the last couple of weeks. But it blows my mind, because here you have a worship leader. You have a guy that's writing hit songs for the church, right? I mean, we're still reading his songs thousands of years later. And he says, man, when I saw the wicked prosper and I saw what was going on in my life and in the righteous people's lives, not only did I not want to be around Christian people in our understanding, I didn't want to be around, believers at all, because I thought I'd cause them to stumble, and my own faith almost stumbled, until I went in and I refocused, and then my eyes were set upon the Lord, and then I understood. And all throughout this book we see, again, it's not the answer of explanation, but of revelation. It's that revelation of who God is. Paul says that my daily strength is coming from focusing on him daily. When you focus on the eternal, the other things fade away. Probably 2 or 3 days ago, I was having some back pain. I think it was from the baptisms. I don't know. I'm getting old, I guess. And I was like, oh, Zaf, can you rub out my back? And he's like, again? You're getting old. And I was like, okay, I joke about being old, but you can't do it because that's a little too real for me, okay? So he's rubbing my back, and I was like, yeah, the older I get, the more it hurts. And he goes, well, in heaven one day it won't hurt, right? It's a good perspective. Right now it does hurt, though. So, but again, I have this 9-year-old trying to share this wisdom with me, and even in that moment, I'm like, yeah, but having that moment of clarity and focusing in, and Job is having a hard time with that. He's wrestling with some hard stuff. Unfortunately, his friends that are going to surround him, that are there and silent and crying and mourning with him, they're going to be wrestling with some stuff, because Job is wrestling with the concept of who God is. And that really is the challenge here, is who is God? Because once you understand the who, the why starts to make sense. Because ultimately, God is not going to say, Job, this is why I'm doing this. But Job goes, why? And finally God says, you want to know why? Here's who I am. Now, again, I know it seems like semantics, but that revelation changes everything for him. And as you and I go through the next few weeks, months, years of this, and we walk through some of this, that curtain is going to keep getting pulled back, where we're going to see glimpses of the back behind the scenes. I think the reason why we're allowed to be able to read it for Job, because we can't read it in our own lives, right? I mean, I would love to sometimes pull back that curtain like, okay, well, that makes sense. That's why you're allowing this to happen. I'm okay with that. But when you and I can't be able to put everything back into focus daily and be able to have in that focus the things, again, that are unseen, focusing on the eternal, that God would be brought into picture, that we'd have a right concept of who he is and what he's doing. So next week, read ahead, chapter 4, 5, and 6. We're gonna keep muscling through this. There is, again, so much in here, and I encourage you to be reading on your own, because we could spend days, months, years, weeks, lifetimes going through this, but we're not, for time's sake. So read through it, and next week we'll start up in chapter 4. Amen? All right, let's pray. Lord, thank you again for your word. Thank you again for the time we have to be able to walk through it. I thank you for sometimes just allowing the real raw feelings to be put before us. And we know this is dialogue. We know this is not, what Job is feeling and what his friends are going to be saying, what his wife is feeling and saying isn't necessarily truth, but it's how they're perceiving things. And I thank you that you don't just leave us there or disregard us and push us off to the side, but that you truly want to see a full revelation of who you are, that we would understand why these things are happening. And for some of us maybe that are walking through that personally, or walking through that with those around us, I ask that we would take the first steps, or that we would come to comfort and mourn and sit with those that are hurt. Not take chapter 4, 5, and 6 by trying to give our own advice, or trying to figure out or muster up or perceive a conception of what we can conceive. But may you just continue to come in view. Thank you again for using real people, for putting real people in front of us. There's nothing more real than a heart that's broken, a life that seems shattered and broken, and to know that all along that your hand and your eyes are upon him. All right, I know that that's the hardest thing to understand in the midst of a trial, or a difficulty, or an affliction. But Lord, for some of us, may we see that behind the scenes you're moving and you're working. May we be less focused on the why, more focused on the who, that eternity would come into perspective. And again, we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.